Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Bern. I'm joined today by a really inspiring candidate, a fierce and fiery progressive from the great state of California, Shahid Buttar. How you doing, Shahid?
Shahid, it's great to be with
Shahid.
you. Thanks for having me on air.
Yeah. Thanks for taking some time to speak with me about your campaign. I watched your race in 2018, and I think you had like a real short runway, like a 3-month campaign, and you way overperformed. Just starting off, what did you learn from that you're carrying into this 2020 race?
The first thing I learned in 2018 was to get into a race early. I didn't come to running for Congress through aspiration. I came to it through frustration. And it was watching my city be relentlessly misrepresented by a relative moderate and on many issues outright authoritarian. And I love San Francisco too much to see our city be represented on the national stage in a way that reinforces Wall Street interests, in a way that reinforces the Pentagon and the military industrial complex, in a way that reinforces the predatory policing, prison industrial slavery complex that so many of us are out in the street resisting right now. I just grew tired of that, and I couldn't frankly take that anymore. So in 2018, I got in the race very late in the game. I led a crowded progressive field. I'm back in 2020 to finish the job, and I'm grateful for all the support that we've received. I will say that we're operating at several orders of magnitude beyond what I experienced in 2018. It's a very humbling experience. I feel a bit like I'm riding a rocket ship, and I'm grateful to all the support that's coming to our campaign from all over the city, across the state, and even across the country.
That's incredible. Well deserved. You are one of the most sort of well-spoken on policy. I watch a lot of your interviews, and you nail it every time.
Thank you.
It's absolutely incredible and inspiring.
I
Obviously
have
it's
had a
Nancy
chance to do
Pelosi.
this work for a long time, so I think that's one thing you're observing. But I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good. And obviously Nancy Pelosi is the candidate. Is the incumbent, and I want to talk about her a little bit, but I also want to get into what you're fighting for, right? Not just the contrast, but
Yes.
and talk about local issues as far as San Franciscans are concerned. But just talk about her. One of the things would be her failures on the front lines of democracy, if you will. Can you talk about her role in enabling Trump right out of the gate?
Absolutely. This is really the reason I'm running for Congress. Insofar as I've seen Nancy Pelosi pave the path for GOP policies and Trump's kleptocracy in particular for entirely too long. And let's just lay out some of the areas. The one that hits very close to home for me as an immigrant is the funding for concentration camps on our nation's borders, which Nancy Pelosi approved. Donald Trump couldn't do that alone. It took Pelosi's acquiescence, and it was reported at the time and then quickly forgotten. Similarly, on the very same day that she announced the House's impeachment charade, and I'll come back to that in a minute, on the very same day, she voted for the president's corporate trade agreement that basically undermined labor and environmental standards around the world. And that was a bipartisan deal pressed by corporate Democrats. Just recognizing this duplicity, this bipartisan railroading of our democracy, and ignoring even the bipartisan interests of the American people. Let's talk about healthcare as a good example of this. But there are bipartisan majorities that favor Medicare for all. And the reason we haven't had a vote in the House is because Nancy Pelosi refuses to bring Pramila Jayapal's bill to the floor. When I look at, you raised democracy, and when I think about the way our democracy is threatened by the bipartisan corporate industrial complex, among the things that really jumps out at me is the bipartisan agreement to waste our civilization's resources on fraudulent military spending. Just last week, the House, led by Nancy Pelosi, approved a $740 billion unprecedented Pentagon budget request in the middle of a pandemic and an economic collapse, before considering any policy to cancel rents and mortgages to help millions of people stay in their homes, before considering universal health care to make sure that our neighbors can get the care and the medicine they need to contain this pandemic and get us on the other side of this crisis, before considering any measure to, for instance, address the crisis in affordable housing that long predated the pandemic and is growing worse because of the economic shutdown, before considering any expansion of paid and sick leave beyond the 20% that she's covered already to include the rest of the workforce and keep our families safe. I think on all these issues, too many others, participating in the cover-up over CIA torture, building the mass incarceration regime, being a cheerleader for every war for plunder abroad, welcoming right-wing despots to Washington and standing alongside them. On too many issues, Nancy Pelosi has revealed herself, despite being the leader of the Democratic Party, to be among the most effective agents of Republican policies in Washington. And I'll just close with one, but and I think this is one that escapes attention. It lurks in the background. It frankly influences almost everything else we talk about. And that's the PAYGO rules. Very early in the speaker's tenure, the very first thing she did as speaker was impose on the House a GOP set of fiscal accounting rules that impose austerity, particularly by forcing any spending on social issues to be offset by corresponding tax increases or spending cuts, but exempting any spending on security issues from the similar requirement. So basically saying we can spend on credit for the Pentagon, but we can't spend on credit to keep people in their homes. And that just seems to be entirely revealing of the speaker's priorities and disqualifying at a time like this.
Yeah, how does she manage to float above that, sort of within that PMC Rachel Maddow crowd? Like, how is it the performative stuff? Everything you said is 100% factual. To put it succinctly, how does she get away with that and still earn votes from Democrats?
I think you just nailed a piece of it, which is to say the establishment corporate media that defers to official narratives. And, this is a critique that we've heard before from figures, everybody from Noam Chomsky to Bernie Sanders has pointed out that we have a media landscape in the United States that is dominated by corporations that have editorial interests and lean on and off the scale. And you can see this illustrated in any number of ways. The way I would particularly describe how she gets away with it is the fact that no major news organization in 30 years has publicly invited her to defend her record. And I'm very eager to have the debate. I'm the first Democrat to ever reach a November election against Nancy Pelosi in her 30-year career. She's never won an election against another Democrat. And as the first Democrat to challenge her, it does behoove not just our campaign and not even just the city, or for that matter, the country and Congress. I would say our democracy is served by the opportunity for an incumbent with her degree of influence and insulation from political accountability to have an opportunity to explain herself, to explain, for instance, why she showed up for impeachment a year late, like a boxer throwing a fight, why she limited the process to excuse all of the president's worst crimes, which effectively ensured that he would remain in office, why she has voted for everything from his military budget and his corporate trade agreement and his concentration camps this degree of collusion that escapes public attention is one that withstands so-called media scrutiny, which, with all respect to the media, is not terribly exacting, but it can't survive a debate against an informed opponent. And you referenced earlier my depth on policy issues. I've been an advocate at the federal level for almost 20 years, and I do wield that background as an advocate and as a candidate. And frankly, Pelosi's never had to answer a critique like mine. I don't think there's, I would put it this way. I often like to distinguish myself from preceding candidates for congressional seats like this. I don't know for certain this is true, but I suspect it is true that I might be the first candidate for Congress in the history of the Republic who has both been invited to the House by multiple members of Congress to brief their aides and colleagues on proposed reforms and arrested in the U.S. Senate for an act of journalism. And that very same independence that led me to ask questions that nobody wants to answer, that nobody has answered or asked since, is very much the sensibility I want to bring to bear on behalf of my neighbors and the people of the United States.
Yeah. And there's, obviously there's she's a speaker, so there's the leadership enablement, which is a massive issue, but your race is still a district specific race, right? So you mentioned the housing crisis. I know that's an issue that goes back a ways, and she's complicit in exacerbating. Can you talk about her history in terms of the housing crisis in San Francisco and how you would differ?
Absolutely. San Francisco is the crucible of a crisis in affordable housing that is stretched across the country and impacted cities from coast to coast, large and small. And I often wonder how different this might be if the head of the Democratic Party were not herself a wealthy commercial landlord, seemingly inclined to protect her own class interests. There was an era until the late 70s when the federal government invested substantial sums, dozens of billions of dollars, in incentives to property developers to ensure that when they built new buildings that they included affordable units. That funding dried up, particularly during Nancy Pelosi's tenure.
Right.
And that was before the pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, as people, so many people, particularly working class folks who can't work from home, aren't able to access their traditional forms of employment, it's creating a housing crisis across the United States. Over 30% of US households were unable to make their July housing payments. And Congress hasn't passed any relief to cancel and suspend payments indefinitely. It's been proposed. A member of the squad, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, has a bill that would do exactly that. And not only would it suspend the payment of rents and mortgages for the duration of the pandemic, it would also provide government support to small landlords so that families, for instance, that have a second home or rent out a room in their home don't get left holding the bag. It basically puts the cost of housing during the economic shutdown on the shoulders of banks and corporate landlords where it belongs. Those are the institutions best prepared to deal with the costs of housing during a shutdown. They're also the institutions that, frankly, we have bailed out before. And let's just be real, will likely at the drop of a hat do again, just given the continuing corporate control of Congress. I think that that's one of the ways in which I describe it. Another one, just to make this kind of sharp, you were asking about local issues, and to make this very poignant, perhaps. This is a story I'm going to tell from a neighborhood in San Francisco, Hunters Point, that intersects housing, environmental racism, and the abdication of oversight by a federal representative who has influence and power, but is not inclined to use it on behalf of our constituents. So Hunters Point is the last Black enclave in San Francisco. It's a neighborhood on the southeast corner of the city. It's the site of a Navy shipyard. It's where the bombs that were dropped in Japan, the weapons of mass destruction that the United States deployed, the only time that they've been deployed in our species' history against the civilian population, those bombs were built at the Hunters Point shipyard, and they poisoned the community. It's a radioactively poisoned site. It's a Superfund site. It's been recognized as such for over 10 years. Corporate cleanup. Nancy Pelosi's helped appropriate money for it while helping engineer the privatization of the land and real estate development at scale on land that is toxic. And the breast cancer rates, the asthma rates in this neighborhood are among the worst in the world. The people suing the corporate fraudulent agents in the cleanup include police officers who used to patrol the neighborhood, thousands of residents, others as well, the Navy, the property developer, everyone. And speaking to the community leaders, the elected representative of that neighborhood on the Board of Supervisors, other people across the city, the story that emerges is that the real issue here at root is the Navy. They're the original sort of like source of this toxic pollution. They're the underlying, they're the ones to whom the contractors are accountable. The Navy has to show up. The only person in the city with any leverage over the Navy is our very powerful member of Congress who hasn't seen fit to use any of that leverage on behalf of the last Black neighborhood in San Francisco that's been poisoned for half a century by our federal government. And in a time where we're all reckoning with Black Lives Matter and what that means, I just want to expand the aperture beyond policing to note in how many other policy areas place too many lives, particularly Black and brown lives, at risk.
Yeah. And you mentioned environmental justice. I would imagine San Francisco, some of the biggest industries, I think, would be tourism, maybe commercial fishing, right? So in appealing to those industries, she's, again, fights actively against the Green New Deal, right? And we're way beyond the point of, even, denying is no different than delaying at this point. Can you talk about you versus her on that issue, the Green New Deal?
Thank you. In some respects, I think of Nancy Pelosi as worse than climate deniers because she claims to believe the science, yet refuses to do anything about it. And when you deride the most visionary proposal to protect the future in a generation as a dream or whatever, those are her words, the Green New Dream or whatever, I think that just indicates the seriousness with which she takes the evaluation of the future's interests. As someone who is very wealthy herself and a commander of a massive pool of capital, she seems very inclined, just like our president, to put Wall Street's interests first. And we see this in the race to reopen economies across the country. I'm grateful that she at least is abandoning that effort as it relates to schools. But the Green New Deal and climate justice is a perfect area. You were describing some of the local industries to which she's beholden. I'd say primarily the local industry to which she's most beholden is finance. But when we look at her stance on climate justice in particular, they're not local industries. It's the fossil fuel industries on other parts of the country. It's also the military industrial interests and the weapons contractors that fuel the wars for profit to extract the petroleum and fossil fuel resources that have driven climate crisis. People often separate energy policy from foreign policy and military policy, but the two, at least for the last 70 years in the United States and our foreign policy around the world, have been inextricably intertwined, because our energy policy, our relentless consumption and addiction to fossil fuel, has been what has driven our abusive, belligerent foreign policy, serial invasions in dozens of countries around the world over the last 70 years alone. And this pattern is one in which Pelosi is absolutely complicit on both ends of the scale, not only inhibiting more aggressive measures to keep it in the ground, to restrain fossil fuels, to subsidize renewable energy, to embolden the various parts of the Green New Deal, especially the federal jobs guarantee and the just transition. She supports none of that. She's also been a relentless cheerleader for these wars for profit that have accelerated and exacerbated the climate crisis. So in both ways, I see her falling very far short of the established consensus in the district. And I do want to be clear about this. San Francisco, there is an established consensus. There are no climate denial is a very marginal perspective here. This is a city that is dedicated to climate justice. We're dedicated to protecting the future, but our federal voice in Washington has not been.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously all of our actions basically buttress any imperialism therein, like you mentioned, right? Even the paid to lose is just as complicit as, being an active participant, right? Yeah. What's the sort of ground game look like in San Francisco for you? Again, going back to that PMC Rachel Maddow kind of bubble, like how do you reach new voters? Like the yous and me's of the districts are on board. We know all the stuff that we're saying, right? Preaching to the choir a little bit, but how do you reach those new folks?
Yes. Before the pandemic and after the pandemic are very different answers. So let me just focus on after, because that's the world we're in now. Since we can't knock on doors and we can't do indoor events, we're doing what we can to leverage outdoor settings to pull people together. So we have a mobile sound stage now. It used to be the Bernie van. And I spent, for instance, July 4th, the morning of July 4th, in a car caravan flanked by dozens of cars mobilized by Code Pink and Extinction Rebellion, going from City Hall to Nancy Pelosi's house, and then over the course of the day to Mission High School, and then back to City Hall, a roving block party across the city over the course of the day. One moment in the morning rings out in my head approaching Pelosi's office, chanting from the roof of the stage, "Defund police," and the Pentagon,
Right,
defund. Right. There's all these cars honking in rhythm. It was so leveraging outdoor events when we can. Our phone banking program is really the critical backbone of our voter outreach strategy. So we have hundreds of volunteers that are making calls each week. We've trained 1,000 people to use the system. It is actually a very similar system to the Bernie dialer. So folks who are making calls for Bernie will find the system very similar. When we were making calls for Bernie, I logged dozens of hours, more frankly in 2016 than in 2020. But when we were making calls for Bernie, we were calling across entire states. And we usually only had a few weeks to do it. It was a very, sort of accelerated, rushed exercise just by virtue of the nature of the process, right? We have one city to cover, and we still have months to do it. And at the pace we're moving, we do have a lot of ground to cover. But at the pace we're moving, I have no doubt that we're going to take the seat, if only because Nancy Pelosi insists on revealing her stripes. If she isn't legislating against the interests of the district, she's alternatively abandoning long established positions to bite parts of our platform off. And she's done that half a dozen times. I take that as a victory. And I see our victory demonstrated every time she's done that to address the bleeding on her flank. And I think she recognizes that having failed to show up for the district for the last 20 years, the district is increasingly poised to show her the door.
Yeah, awesome. And people can go to your website and sign up and volunteer and join that. You have an amazing text campaign too. I get texts pretty consistently, which is incredible.
I should note what the website is. It's shahidforchange.us, and we'd invite any of your listeners and viewers to check us out.
Right on. Another kind of component of her failure, the election day for you is November 3rd, right? Same as a
That's right.
presidential election, right?
That's right. We can replace Trump and Pelosi at the same time.
Yeah. So, the thought in the back of my head is like, God forbid he wins, what would she enable in a second term? Right.
Right.
Yeah, we need you, man. So, it's a critical race. It's a winnable race. It's a solid blue district. Have you gotten any local media attention? And I'm assuming you've pushed for a debate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we had an empty chair debate covered by the San Francisco Chronicle just last weekend. The Chronicle's covered us. Mission Local has covered us. 48 Hills, Broadcast Stewart is a prominent local blog, as well as a number of national outlets, everyone from the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, Rising, Rolling Stone, Progressive, Salon, Slate. We've had a current affairs. We've had an opportunity to get the word out. And I would say this, I hope very much that as Nancy Pelosi appears in the news over the coming months, that the opportunities to contrast her record with the alternative we present is one that news sources take advantage of. And a debate, I think, would be very illuminating for both the district and our democracy. Again, she hasn't had to answer for her record in 30 years. And, you were just saying that we need you. And I very much appreciate that. It's kind of you to say. I would put it like this. I am an immigrant who cares very deeply about this country, and I grew up in the Midwest. I'm frankly rabidly patriotic to the principles that we wrote on paper, the very same principles that Dr. King tried to hold us accountable to. If we just followed our principles, our practices would be so very different. The paradigm would be so very different. And I come to the political arena having been an organizer and an activist across all these different movements, from immigrant rights to peace and justice to civil liberties over the last 20 years to gay rights, when Nancy Pelosi was absent or actively promoting authoritarian interests. And the reason I think I can be helpful is that, having done for 20 years the work of defending our republic against all enemies, foreign and domestic, including, unfortunately, the incumbent Speaker of the House, without having sworn an oath yet to do that, I'm very eager to swear that oath, and with the power of a seat in Congress, particularly ask the questions that haven't been asked, to join the squad and build the ranks that would support, for instance, making Barbara Lee or perhaps Pramila Jayapal the next Speaker of the House, to actually resist this criminal president instead of signing every funding request that he sends up the hill. And you seized on this before, and I want to just draw a circle around the performative resistance, I think you called it, that Nancy Pelosi uses to get credit from corporate media for meaningless acts, while supporting, in fact, and in somewhat the shadows, the policy agenda of our criminal president. And this has been true on issue after issue. And that's with a lot of institutional power and privilege. I don't have any institutional power or privilege or property. I'm not an oligarch, right? I mean, she's an oligarch who at least defers, if not being actively complicit. I don't have any privilege, and I've used whatever I've got in the last 20 years to, at any point before now, one might say, tilt at the windmill of justice. And as our civilization and culture have frankly caught up, and more people are getting woke and understanding just how bad it has been long before Trump, that's creating the aperture for a voice like mine to represent and help represent not just San Francisco, but our movement. But because I think a lot of people are recognizing that the response to Trump is only the tip of the iceberg, that to actually get at justice, to get at the root of many of our social problems, we have to understand our history, and we need to elect voices who understand our history and have fought to expand rights, not voices who demonstrate their corporate fundraising prowess and constituting a legislative body based on that. And I'm proud to offer my neighbors an alternative this November.
Amazing. Yeah. And thank you for running in 2018, and thank you for staying in the fight and running again. I'd love to have you back on before the November election.
I'd be thrilled.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, good sir. I understand you have a hard stop, so I'm going to let you go, but thank you for taking the time. I look forward to speaking with you again, and, helping fight get Barbara Lee in the speaker position once you're in the House. So
right on.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me, Eric. It's great to be with you.
Thank you.